I'm Larissa MacFarquhar, and the book I wrote, oh, not that one, maybe it'll be there, is called Strangers Drowning, and it's about people who live lives of extraordinary moral commitment. And I wrote it because I wanted to figure out why the rest of us, myself very much included, don't give more than we do. Which is odd because, as we all know, giving is pleasurable. So giving something away often makes you happier than keeping it. So why don't we give more? And I thought the usual answer is we're human, we're selfish, we like our stuff too much to give it up. And of course, all that's true. But I didn't think it was the whole story. Another part of the story is that the need of the world is so infinite that it can seem hopeless to try to do anything about it. Or if we did try to do something serious about it, it seems like it might involve a frightening amount of sacrifice. So is it possible, I wanted to know, to live an ambitiously good life without making yourself completely miserable? And what is a good life? I think we can probably agree that most of us could do more, but how much should we do? Once you commit yourself to a life of helping others, this actually becomes a really difficult and important question, because you're not just giving up bits of extra time and bits of extra stuff, but things that are much more precious. Things like spontaneity, or certain kinds of freedom, or if you're committing yourself fully to helping strangers, at some point this will conflict with your ability to give all you can to your family. See, it's a real problem. Can you hear me? Yeah. But is it right to give to strangers at the expense of the people you love? In other words, to me, this adds up to what matters most in life. So I'll tell you a story to give you an example of what I mean. One of the people I wrote about is named Baba Amte, and he was born into an aristocratic family in India. And he was a very macho guy. He was always fighting, very brave, and this was really the core of his self-image. And one day he was walking along, and he passes a leper lying at the side of the road, almost dead, in the last stages of the disease, his nose caved in, his flesh crawling with maggots. And he was horrified by this sight, and he was scared of catching the disease, so he ran away. And then he realized that he, Baba Amte, had run away like a coward. And he was so horrified by this image of himself that he decided to steer directly into this fear and make leprosy his life's work. And the first thing he did was enroll in a school of tropical medicine. He was a lawyer, so he needed to know something. And while he was there, the professor told him that there wasn't a cure for leprosy as yet, in part because it seemed to be impossible to transmit the disease to animals for the purposes of experiments. And Baba thought about this for a day, and then he offered himself as a human experimental subject. And he was injected with the leprosy bacillus, but he didn't catch the disease. As it happened, shortly after he finished his course at the school, there was a cure for leprosy found. But then in India, as now, most leprosy patients couldn't afford to go to a doctor, or if they did find a doctor, it was much too late. They had all the unmistakable symptoms, and people were so terrified by them that they had all the same problems they'd had before. They were thrown out of their families, thrown out of their villages, sometimes burned alive. So even once there was a cure, leprosy colonies were still necessary. Baba decided to found one. He persuaded the state to give him a tract of land for this purpose, but it was wilderness, no water, no shelter, and wild animals everywhere. He moved out there with his wife, his 2 baby sons, 6 leprosy patients, and 4 dogs to protect them from the animals. One by one, each of these 4 dogs was carried off and eaten by one of the local panthers. And now I went to visit the place 60 years later. It's an extraordinary place. It's not just a place where a refuge for people who have nowhere else to live. It's a real community. It has a college, it has schools, people get married there, have children there, they live there their whole lives. But this is what I mean when I say that people who are really committed are prepared to make astonishing sacrifices. Baba's 2 sons were not carried off and eaten like the dogs, but they might have been. They didn't catch leprosy, but they might have done. This conflict between family and strangers, helping one, helping the other, came up for everyone I spoke to for this book, but it took different forms. I'll tell you another story. Sue and Hector Badeau met as high school sweethearts in Vermont, and they decided to get married, and they decided they'd always wanted to adopt children who needed families, so they decided to have two and adopt two, and they did. But once they got involved in the adoption world, they heard about so many children in this country who will probably never get adopted because they're too old, or they're the wrong race, or they have too many brothers and sisters, or they're too traumatized and disturbed. And they couldn't bear the thought of all these children having no families at all. So they started adopting more and more. And they ended up adopting 20 special needs children in addition to the 2 biological kids they had. And in the beginning, this was really fun. The kids welcomed other children. It was more kids to play with. It was great. But as the family grew larger and their kids grew older, and they started asking the older kids to help out with the younger kids, they grew resentful. And they started saying, Mom, Dad, you've got to stop adopting. We don't have enough of your time and attention as it is. We have no money. You've got to stop. And for an ordinary parent, that would be the end of it. It's making my children unhappy. I'm going to stop. But Sue and Hector couldn't stop thinking about those other children, even though they were still strangers to them, whom they knew if they didn't adopt them, no one was going to, and they were going to spend their whole childhoods going from foster home to foster home to foster home and never have a family at all. So for them, if they could immeasurably improve the lives of those kids, it was worth it. Now, these are really difficult choices. Should they have kept adopting? Should Baba have exposed his baby children to that kind of danger? When I started writing this book, I knew, of course, that people were going to disagree about the right thing to do. What I didn't understand, which was sort of a surprise to me, was that many people don't find people of extraordinary moral commitment admirable at all. I found that some thought they were nice, but sort of insipid. There's a kind of cliche out there that evil people are fascinating and complex, but good people are kind of simple and dull. And I was talking to a novelist I know about this one day because it frustrated me that there weren't these characters in novels. I didn't read about them anywhere. And I said, why don't you novelists write about these people? And he gave me this look of total contempt, like I'd asked him to write a novel about puppies and butterflies or something like that. On the other hand, something like half the people I spoke to said, oh, those moral types, they're all mentally ill, right? They seemed to think that there must be something weird, something twisted about a person who is that selfless. And I became really fascinated by these conflicted feelings about morality, and I ended up tracing a history of this kind of skepticism in our culture from the past 200 years. And I found its roots everywhere, in economic theory, in evolutionary psychology and biology, in psychoanalysis, certainly, in the pop culture notion of codependency, and most deeply, actually, in fiction, in novels. And this became another reason why I wanted to write this book, is I wanted to show that there's a beauty and a grandeur to a rigorously moral life, and that ambitious, passionate goodness can be as complex and as fascinating, and even sometimes as frightening as evil. It may seem weird, given the kinds of things I've told you about so far, but everyone I wrote about in this book has also had to do something that is very difficult for them, which is to draw moral limits that they can live with. Another example, I first met Julia Wise when she was a few years out of Bryn Mawr. And she had always believed that she was no more important or valuable than anyone else. And so she thought it was unjust that she should be comfortable while other people were desperately poor. And her first thought was, oh, I should be a foreign aid worker. And then she did some looking into that, and she thought, well, actually, that doesn't quite make sense for me to be some blundering foreigner trying to fix another country that I know nothing about. The humbler, more practical thing to do is to stay home, earn a first world salary, and donate it to charities that really know what they're doing. But once she set out on this path, it made her life almost intolerable at first, because every time she went to a grocery store, she would agonize over, can she justify buying peanut butter? Can she justify buying cereal? She really went through agonies, and another person I spoke to said, you know, no one would buy a soda if there was a starving child standing next to the vending machine. But for her, there was always a starving child standing next to the vending machine. But she thought, you know what, this is stupid. I cannot go through my life seeing starving children in every supermarket. I will go insane. and that will not be helpful to anyone. So she and her husband came up with a system where they would donate a fixed percentage of their joint salaries every year. It was usually between 50 and 75%, and then they would spend the rest as they liked. And that worked, but she had to make another big decision, which was, should she have a child? And she'd always wanted children, ever since she was a child herself, but she thought, well, even if I'm a very frugal mother, which I certainly will be, inevitably I will end up giving money to the child that I would otherwise have donated. And so, by having my own child, I will, in effect, be killing other people's children. This is how it looked to her. And so she struggled with this for a long time, as you can imagine. But ultimately she thought, you know, this is the point at which I break. If I don't have a child, my life will seem so bleak and so empty to me that I will be in danger of losing my commitment altogether. And so she decided to have a baby. Sometimes people ask Sue and Hector, why did you have to be so extreme about it? Why 20 kids to adopt? Why didn't you just adopt 1 or 2 special needs kids and have an easy, more comfortable life? And what they didn't understand is that Sue and Hector never wanted an easy life. They didn't just love their children. They loved the challenge. They didn't love their life in spite of the difficulty, but because of that. And I came to realize that in many ways, the people I'm writing about are sort of similar to other very, very driven people. They're extremely passionate about what they do, and they're incredibly ambitious. They don't settle for what's reasonable or normal. They aim as high as they possibly can. And in that way, they're like other workaholics. They're like the founder of a startup who never goes home, or an artist who locks himself away and doesn't see anybody until he's finished his work. And I started thinking, you know, when you're starting out in life, people are always talking to you about ambition and finding your passion. And the idea seems to be that when you go to college, your job is to figure out what makes you happiest and then go for it. But this is what I admire so much about the people I wrote about, is that they're even more ambitious than that. They set out to build a good life, not just for themselves, but for many other people too. And they're not even miserable. I mean, you saw Magnus, not a miserable guy, and he's done something extraordinary. And, you know, because they've given up some comforts for sure, but in exchange, they have this deep and happy sense of purpose. They know that they have changed many lives for the better, and they feel that they are living their own lives the way they ought to. And how many of us can say that? Thank you very much.